Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Morton Blackwell, President of the Leadership Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our February Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. I congratulate you for getting here. Helen sometimes walks over here because she likes to get in her walk every day, but she was in the car with me and had a little trouble getting the ice off the windshields this morning, and we drove and we parked there beside the building, and I got out and messing around with the snow. I got out and I saw that Helen had gotten far ahead of me, and so I walked quickly to the corner of the building, and she'd already gone inside, and I came in and I said, "Well, has Helen come?" And they said, "No, we haven't seen her." she was trapped in the car with the ice bank there beside her, but she had rescued herself by the time I got back to the car, and she made it fine. But I know that it wasn't easy to get here for many of you, and I appreciate your coming. We live in interesting times, and sometimes there are interesting juxtapositions. We have all seen in the news media reports that in the District of Columbia there are excessive levels of lead in the water, and people are panicked over there. And we also see that the president is proposing fairly significant changes in the budgeting and wants to restrict all things that can be restricted to at most a 1% growth, which would be about 7% less than in recent years in terms of growth, which causes me to realize, and when then the Congress, the Republicans this morning are saying that it's they're going to propose cuts beyond those that the president is proposing. But don't hold your breath, because in either of these crises, because we all know that getting Washington, D.C. to get the lead out is not easy. Not easy. Ladies and gentlemen, you can purchase a copy of this morning's presentation or any of a number of past Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfasts. Our Center for Print and Broadcast Media will gladly provide you with as many of those tapes as you'd like at $15 a piece, and you can order them I guess at the elevator area. It's there for you, and there are a lot of excellent presentations, and my guess is that the number of you are going to want the presentation that we're going to hear today. In 2003, the Leadership Institute trained 3,562 students in 144 schools, and we placed 59 job seekers through our free employment placement service. You have before you on the table our current schedule of schools for 2004. We will add many more schools to that list as the year continues. I ask that you take a moment to review these schools and consider attending one of our programs this year and recommending our programs to those who would benefit from them. Now I'm going to introduce Dana Stevens for an invocation and pledge of allegiance. Dana got his political start with Congressman Jack Kingston of Georgia, and he joined Congressman Kingston's office in 2002, where he gained valuable legislative and political experience. After joining the congressman's team, Dana was a fundraiser with the Friends of Jack Kingston. In the fall of last year, Dana was very involved with Rich Kelsey's campaign for Arlington County Board in Northern Virginia. And Dana now works for us at the Leadership Institute as a grassroots coordinator. Dana was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, and I hope he appreciated the grits as our speaker and I did this morning. And Dana studied political science and graduated from Hampton-Sydney College. Yeah.
Good morning. If you don't mind standing and joining me for the prayer. O Lord, our heavenly Father, the high and mighty ruler of the universe, who dost from thy throne behold all dwellers upon earth, most heartily we beseech thee with thy favor to behold and bless thy servant, the President of the United States, and all others in authority, and so replenish them with the grace of thy Holy Spirit, that they may always incline to do thy will and walk in thy way, and do them plenteously with heavenly gifts. Grant them in health and prosperity long to live, and finally after this life to attain everlasting joy and felicity, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And now, if you don't mind joining me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, and for that invocation as well, Dana. Seems to me I heard echoes of the 1928 Book of Common Prayer in that invocation. And now I'm going to introduce Parker Hamilton to you. She'll give us an update on the activities of the Programs Department. Parker is director of our campus leadership program here. She oversees our efforts to battle the left on college campuses across America and to stand up for conservative principles. Prior to joining the Institute staff, Parker served at the White House under President George W. Bush, the U.S. House Committee on Education and the Workforce, the Brent Schundler for Governor campaign, and the College Republican National Committee, where she served as executive director in the first term of Scott Stewart. Dana oversaw that group's largest expansion in nearly 20 years. She's a native of Sarasota Springs, New York, where I don't think grits is frequently on the menu. But she's a graduate of Brown University, where conservatives are certainly an endangered species, and she currently resides in Washington, D.C., where conservatives have made some progress in recent years. Parker Hamilton.
Thank you to Morton for that introduction. Good morning to everybody. As he said, I'm Parker Hamilton, and I have been for about 3 weeks the director of the Campus Leadership Program. So I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm extremely excited to be heading up the Leadership Institute's CLP program, where we are traveling to college campuses and we are educating students about how they can fight the left on their campuses, battle leftist professors and speech codes, and hopefully take back campuses one college at a time. The programs department is, as you can see from your schedule, busy with a number of schools this spring. The Campus Leadership Program is focusing specifically on our youth leadership schools. For those of you who don't know, the youth leadership schools train students primarily to be youth coordinators on political campaigns. They're also great for students who are starting conservative leadership program clubs on their campuses to get them involved politically, that sort of thing. So this spring we are hosting 17 youth leadership schools. Last year we trained 697 students in the youth leadership school, and I am very optimistic and hopeful that we will break that record this year. This spring we're traveling all over the country. We're doing about 2 schools a weekend until the first week of May, so we're going to be very busy. This weekend we kick off our first 2 schools of the spring in Las Vegas, Nevada, and Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And we're expecting great turnouts there. We're going to continue on all over the country: New Mexico, Ohio, Maine, North Carolina, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Wisconsin, Washington, Missouri, Georgia, and Oregon. So we are hitting all 4 corners of the country, and we should have, by the end of this round, hundreds of new students trained to be youth coordinators, hundreds of students who understand what they can do on their campuses to instill conservatism, and we're very optimistic that this is going to be a great spring for the Campus Leadership Program and for conservative students. So if anyone has any questions about the CLP program, the Youth Leadership School, please feel free to see me after the breakfast, and I hope you enjoy today's speaker. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to welcome Dr. Daniel Dreisbach. Dr. Dreisbach comes to us from American University, where he is a professor at their Public Affairs School. Prior to his position with American University, Dr. Dreisbach earned a PhD in philosophy from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He also attained a JD from the University of Virginia. And as he was former managing editor of the Journal of Law and Politics, Dr. Dreisbach also found time in his illustrious career to write 2 books, one being Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State, the second, Real Threat and Mere Shadow, Religious Liberty and the First Amendment. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel Dreisbach.
Got off to a good start here, knocked off my microphone. Well, good morning to you. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I thank you so much for your warm and generous reception. You honor me with your presence this morning. We've been having snow and rumors of snow, and so I'm delighted that you are here in the midst of this wintry season. Thank you, Dana, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here at this institution that has done so much over the years to nurture leadership, leadership based in character and conviction. And so I'm thrilled to be here today. This morning I want to talk about the public role of religion in the American constitutional tradition. In particular, I want to talk about the uses and misuses of Thomas Jefferson in redefining what the Constitution has to say about the appropriate relationship between church and state. Now, this is going to be a cautionary tale because, as I will argue, I believe history has been greatly misused and distorted by courts and commentators over the years. I'm reminded this morning of a cartoon that I saw many years ago in the New Yorker magazine. It showed 2 of the Pilgrim Fathers standing on the deck of the Mayflower. Behind them, metaphorically, was the old world and religious persecution and all that entailed. And in front of them, of course, was that great, shining city on a hill and the hopes and aspirations of religious liberty. And one Pilgrim Father was saying to the other, "My short-term goal is religious liberty, but in the long term, I want to get into real estate." Now, I like this story because it encapsulates, amusingly, I think, some of the tensions and contradictions in this story of the pursuit of religious liberty in American history. Yes, the pursuit of religious liberty is a very important element in that story. It's part of my own family's story. My ancestors came to this country in the mid-18th century from a part of Germany where their own pursuit of religious exercise was threatened by a prince in their district of a different faith. And they faced persecution, and that was in large part the motivation for them to make that long trip across the Atlantic Ocean. But I'm also reminded that the pursuit of mammon also played a part in the founding of this country. And so there's a sort of a mixture of motivations that play such an important part in the creation of this great republic. This cartoon also reminds me of the importance of how we tell the story. And I think this is so important on this topic of church and state because, as I've already indicated, and I will elaborate this morning, the story of church and state in America, I fear, has been told in our schools and by the media in a very twisted and distorted way. And I think the consequences of that have been, I think, very unfortunate. And we know what those consequences are. I was reminded of that just a few minutes ago when we were saying the pledge. We came very close, I think, to violating the Constitution, right? We said those words under God. And there are, as you well know, a controversy of that nature before the court today. And I think this is one of those products of this misuse of history. There is a wealth of new and exciting research that is coming out in recent years, and I have been thankful to contribute a very small part of that. But this new research, I think, is forcing us to rethink conventional interpretations of church and state in the American experience. And so this is what I want to talk about this morning. And I'm going to start with a couple of phrases that are very familiar to everyone in this room. Separation of church and state. A wall of separation between church and state. Now, I'm sure that in this audience, all of you know that these are terms, phrases that are not literally found in the United States Constitution. But as you know, that there are many judges in this country who would not know that and write opinions as if they do not know that. So I want to ask a couple questions this morning and address a couple of these questions, starting with the question, well, where did these phrases come from? Why are these phrases so influential in American legal and political thought? And finally, I want to ask, why should you care about these phrases? In 1947, the Supreme Court of the United States was asked to interpret the First Amendment's prohibition on laws respecting an establishment of religion. And the court famously declared, and I'm going to quote here, in the words of Jefferson, the First Amendment erected a wall of separation that must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve the slightest breach, end quote. It's this language, this landmark ruling of 1947 that I believe has laid the foundations for the systematic removal of religion from American public life that we've all witnessed in recent years. The wall of separation metaphor in particular provides the rationale with a veneer of historical legitimacy for subsequent judicial decisions banning prayer in school, stripping public spaces of the Ten Commandments and other religious symbols, and excluding religious citizens and organizations such as faith-based social welfare agencies from full participation in civic life on the same terms as their secular counterparts. Now, lest you think that this is language of a half century ago and language that does not influence the court today, let me remind you, just in the last year or so, in a very important Supreme Court decision, Justice John Paul Stevens had this to say, and I don't have the words in front of me, so I'm going to have to recall this from memory, but this is pretty close to a direct quote. He says, "Our democracy is threatened whenever we remove a brick from the wall of separation." Think about that. I find that a stunning statement. Our democracy is threatened whenever we remove a brick from the wall of separation. Now, to my mind, I think he's got it exactly wrong. I could not disagree more in this sense. To the extent that this wall of separation today is used to deny people of faith from participating in public life, to the extent that this wall of separation is used to tell people of faith, communities of faith, don't bother to participate in public life, that's what threatens our democracy. But I bring to your attention this language because it reminds us of the continuing influence of this metaphor on the court today. Now, at the foundations of this jurisprudence, we find Thomas Jefferson and his metaphor. And I think it's fair to say that there is no metaphor in American law that has had a more profound influence on law and policy than this wall of separation metaphor. In our own time, the wall of separation has been accepted by many Americans as an authoritative expression of the First Amendment and adopted by courts and commentators as a rule of constitutional law, and in some respects supplanting the actual text of the First Amendment. So again, I ask, what is the source of this figure of speech, and how has this symbol of strict separation between religion and public life come to dominate our church-state law and policy? I've written this book that Dana mentioned in the introduction, a book called Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State. And in this book, I challenge the conventional secular myth that Thomas Jefferson, or the constitutional framers in general, erected a high wall between religion and the civil government. So I ask you to step back with me about 200 years in American history. Thomas Jefferson, as you will recall, was inaugurated the third president of the United States on March 4th, 1801, following one of the most bitterly contested presidential elections in history. His religion, or perhaps to be a little bit more accurate, the alleged lack thereof, had emerged a critical issue in that campaign. His Federalist Party opponents vilified him as an infidel and an atheist. The campaign rhetoric was so vitriolic that when news of Jefferson's election began to sweep across the country, housewives in Federalist New England were literally seen in their gardens burying the family Bibles, because the rhetoric of the campaign had been so intense that there was real fear that this new administration in Washington would be confiscating the Holy Scriptures and burning them. Now, this may seem strange to us today, but let me remind you that at this very time, Americans were beginning to receive alarming news of the French Revolution, which Jefferson, of course, was said to support. And in France, in this very dark times, there was indeed widespread desecration of religious sanctuaries and symbols. And so many Americans, seeing that identity between Jefferson and the French Revolution, thought quite likely that we'd see the same kinds of things here on these shores. Now, in spite of this language, this rhetoric of the presidential campaign of 1800, there was one pocket of support for Jeffersonian Republicans in Federalist New England. Now, you remember, Jefferson's opponent was John Adams, and New England was his stronghold. But in New England, you find essentially one small pocket of support for Jefferson. And this was among the Baptists. At the dawn of the 19th century, Jefferson's Federalist opponents, led by Adams, dominated New England politics, and the Congregationalist Church was still legally established in states like Connecticut and Massachusetts. Now, the Baptists supported Jefferson, and they were outsiders in their own land. They were a beleaguered political minority, being Republicans in Federalist New England. They were, of course, a religious minority, being Baptist evangelical dissenters in that bastion of Congregationalism. And so they looked to Jefferson to be a harbinger of religious liberty. They hoped that Jefferson would bring to the country, as president, the kind of dawn of religious liberty that Jefferson had labored for in his native Virginia in decades earlier. And so the Danbury Baptists write Jefferson a letter. I characterize this as a fan letter, congratulating him on his election to the Chief Magistrate of the United States and celebrating his lifelong commitment to religious liberty. And on January 1, 1802, just a little over 200 years ago, Jefferson sat down as president to write a response to the Danbury Baptists. This is a very carefully crafted reply in which Jefferson endorses the Baptists and their aspirations for religious liberty. And then he goes on to say, the First Amendment has denied Congress the authority to establish a religion or prohibit its free exercise. Thus, and here I quote Jefferson, building a wall of separation between church and state, end quote. Now, in my book, I look at this wall in its historical context, and I conclude that it is used today in ways that its architect almost certainly would not recognize and perhaps would even repudiate. First of all, throughout his public career, including his 2 terms as president, Jefferson pursued policies incompatible with this so-called high and impregnable wall of separation that the modern Supreme Court has erroneously attributed to Jefferson. For example, he endorsed the use of federal funds to build churches and to support Christian missionaries working among the Indians. And the absurd conclusion that countless courts and commentators would have us reach is that Jefferson routinely pursued policies that violated his own wall of separation. Secondly, Jefferson's wall, as a matter of federalism, remember federalism is that system of government that separates power between a centralized authority and regional governments. Jefferson's wall, as a matter of federalism, was erected between the national government on one side and state governments on the other in matters pertaining to religion. In other words, and I want you to listen very carefully because this is a critical point, Jefferson placed the federal government on one side of his wall and state governments and church authorities on the other. Okay? So his wall was not primarily between church in all its forms on one side and the state in all its forms on the other. Rather, this was a metaphor affirming this principle, this most important of American political principles, federalism. Now, in my book, I support this argument both from the text as well as from the context. And I'm just going to take just a moment here to give you a sense, a flavor of the contextual argument. Jefferson tells us very clearly why he's writing this letter to the Danbury Baptists. He has a very specific controversy in mind. His predecessor in the White House, John Adams, had issued a number of Thanksgiving Day proclamations. And Jefferson and his colleagues, his political allies, had very skillfully used that as what we'd call today a wedge issue. They used Adams' Thanksgiving Day proclamations to spread the fear that Adams was about to promote a national church. And this was his way of doing so. Now, this was very useful to Jefferson because it was a way of bringing on board to his own political cause religious dissenters who feared greatly the idea of an established church, like the Church of England in the Old World. So Jefferson tells us that first of all, let me say, Jefferson as president was promptly asked to do as Adams and Washington had done, which was to issue such Thanksgiving Day proclamations. And of course, at this point, he refuses because of the position he had just taken months earlier on John Adams' Thanksgiving Day proclamations. So he tells us that he wants to write this letter to explain why he is declining to issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation. Now, this is important to him because, of course, to his opponents, his refusal to issue such proclamations was simply affirmation that he was an infidel and an atheist, like they had said he was during the presidential campaign of 1800. Now, what is the reason Jefferson gives for his his position on Thanksgiving Day proclamations? The reason he gives is rooted in federalism. In federalism, he says Thanksgiving Day proclamations is a matter left to state and local authorities. I look at the First Amendment, Jefferson says, and it says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. He interpreted that very broadly. He says if Congress cannot do something of this nature, the powers of the executive are purely derivative of the legislative branch. They execute the law, right? Then I can't do what Congress cannot do, not because Thanksgiving Day proclamations are inherently inappropriate, but because the Constitution has said this is something denied the legislative and by extension the executive branch at the federal level, but it's a power retained by state executives. And indeed we know that when Jefferson was governor of Virginia, he issued Thanksgiving Day proclamations, affirming that federalism is the basis of this wall of separation that he has built in this letter. Okay? So if you understand the context of the letter, you understand this important political principle that he's explaining. Now, today, what worries me is I believe the wall of separation has been a source of much mischief in church-state law. This wall of separation, I fear, has reconceptualized, indeed, I would say misconceptualized First Amendment principles. And it has done so in at least two important ways. First, Jefferson's metaphor emphasizes separation between church and state, unlike the First Amendment, which uses the language of non-establishment or disestablishment and the free exercise of religion. Now, I think it's unfortunately that today we oftentimes conflate these terms as if disestablishment, non-establishment means the same thing as separation. But I assure you that in the lexicon of 1800, these terms meant very, very different things. Indeed, Jefferson's Baptist correspondents who agitated for disestablishment but not for separation were discomfited by Jefferson's figurative phrase and indeed went so far as to even suppress the letter that they received from Jefferson, because Jefferson uses the language of separation, which is not their agenda. Their agenda was disestablishment. There were few. The Baptists, of course, I think, were worried that this language of separation would, and they were prescient, I would say, in this fear. They feared that this wall would come to separate religious influences from public life and policy. And there were few in America in 1800, certainly few among the evangelical dissenters who challenged the widespread assumption of the age that Republican government and civic virtue were dependent on a moral people and that morals could be nurtured only by the Christian religion. A second way in which this metaphor, I think, misconceptualizes the First Amendment has to do with the very nature of a wall. A wall is a bilateral barrier, right? If you have a wall, it's as hard to get from side A to side B as it is to get from side B to side A. However, let's look at the First Amendment. Who is restricted by the words of the First Amendment? The restrictions in the First Amendment, like the entire Bill of Rights, indeed like the entire Constitution, are on government only. Government only, specifically on Congress. But if you say that the First Amendment has erected a wall of separation, you not only restrict government, but then you restrict what's on the other side of the wall, which is the church, the community of faith. And that, I would argue, exceeds the restrictions of the First Amendment. And indeed, it's because of this that courts use the First Amendment with its so-called wall of separation to restrict people of faith in public life, to silence the religious voice in public life. And that is the dangerous misconception of the wall of separation. It recharacterizes, it reframes what the First Amendment is all about. Now let me just say here as an aside, I don't believe that very many so-called strict separationists are in fact honest and consistent adherents to their own high wall of separation. Virtually all the strict separationists I know, and here you can include your own favorite strict separationists, the American Civil Liberties Union and similar organizations, they are very happy to use the wall to separate religion from public life, from public concerns, but very few of them consistently argue that the state should be separated from the concerns of the church. Few strict separationists are willing, even in strict adherence to their own metaphor, to exempt churches, clergy, and religious entities from the civil state's generally applicable civil rights, criminal, employment, tax, and zoning laws, as well as health and safety regulations, which suggests to me that the other side is really arguing for a one-sided wall, as absurd of a metaphor as that is. They want to keep religion out of the public square, but they're very content to have the state intrude upon, regulate, control the concerns of the church. And I think that brings me to this question that I raised at the beginning. Why should we care about this metaphor? I think we should care about the wall because it is used to separate religion from public life, thereby promoting a religion that is essentially private and a state that is strictly secular. This would have been alarming to the founders because they viewed religion, to paraphrase George Washington's famous lines from the Farewell Address, they viewed religion as an indispensable support for social order and political prosperity. You all, I'm sure, know the line that I'm referencing from the Farewell Address. I think it's a little bit unfortunately that in our little excerpting from the Farewell Address, we oftentimes skip over the very next line that Washington uses. I don't have the words in front of me, so I'm going to have to paraphrase here, but he says something to this effect. He says, "In vain would that man claim the mantle of patriotism who would undermine those pillars of religion and morality." Think about that for a second. He's saying, the way I read this is he's saying, if you're out there undermining religion and morality, which are the indispensable supports for social order and political prosperity, you're coming perilously close to treason. You're knocking at the very foundations of our civil order. Think about that. Those are, I think, just remarkable words. This high and impregnable wall that the modern Supreme Court has constructed has been used to inhibit religion's ability to inform the public ethic and policy. It has been used to deprive religious citizens of the civil liberty to participate in politics, armed with ideas informed by their spiritual values. It has been used to infringe the right of religious communities and institutions to extend their prophetic ministries into the public square. Jefferson's misunderstood metaphor has been used to silence the religious voice in the marketplace of ideas and to segregate faith communities behind a restrictive barrier. I want to sort of begin to wrap up here by raising an uncomfortable fact, but an uncomfortable fact that I think we must confront, and that is this. For much of American history, this language of separation of church and state and its attendant metaphoric formulation of a wall of separation has been the expression of exclusion, intolerance, and bigotry. These phrases have been used, as I've said before, to silence people and communities of faith and to exclude them from full participation in public life. And we see this time and time again in American history. Interestingly enough, we first begin to see this language of separation of church and state, religion and politics, begin to enter in American public life at the end of the 18th century. But what's interesting is this language was not introduced by people who were advocating this separation. Rather, it was introduced by the establishmentarians, those who promoted an establishment church, and they were using the language essentially as a political smear against the religious dissenters who were arguing for disestablishment. And in essence, what they were saying is, if those religious dissenters are successful in disestablishment, that's going to lead to a separation of religion and public life, which is going to lead to public licentiousness and political atheism. And thereby they were using this language of separation to raise fears against what it was the evangelicals, dissenters, were arguing for. We've already seen how the language was used in the election of 1800. Jefferson's supporters, the Jeffersonian Republicans, cynically advocated the rhetoric and policy of separation not to promote religious worship, but to silence those Federalist clergymen who were denouncing Jefferson for his support of the French Revolution. Think about that. Separation of church and state is being used in the campaign of 1800 to silence clergymen who dare to speak out on matters of public concern. I can say here as an aside, this reminds me very much as to how organizations like the ACLU use separation of church and state today, right? We then see the separationist rhetoric returning to fashion in the 1830s and 1840s, and again in the last quarter of the 19th century, when waves of Catholic immigrants with their peculiar liturgy and resistance to assimilation into a Protestant establishment began to arrive on American shores. Nativist elements, including the Know-Nothings and later the Ku Klux Klan, embraced separationist rhetoric and principles in a continuing and often violent campaign to restrict the role of Catholics in public life. Again, in the mid-20th century, the rhetoric was revived and ultimately constitutionalized by anti-Catholic elites, people like John Dewey, Hugo Black, and their fellow travelers in the American Civil Liberties Union, and an organization known as Protestants and Other Americans Unite for the Separation of Church and State. They've changed their name, by the way, that organization. They now call themselves Americans United for Separation of Church and State. But they used to be known as Protestants and Other Americans, which should tell you a little bit of where they're coming from on this debate. They feared the influence and wealth of the Catholic Church and perceived parochial education as a threat to public schools and democratic values. And here we could look at Justice Hugo Black as a case study in the convergence of separationist and anti-Catholic sentiment. Black, of course, was the chief architect of the wall of separation metaphor as it was used by the Supreme Court in the mid-20th century. A recent book by Philip Hamburger has noted the remarkable confluence of Protestant, nativist, and progressive anti-Catholic forces in Justice Black's political thought. Justice Black's association, you may recall, of course, that Justice Black was a former member of the Ku Klux Klan. And while Black's association with the Klan has been much discussed in connection with his liberal views on race, it probably tells us more about his views on separation of church and state. This book that I'm quoting from, Black had long before sworn under lights of flaming crosses to preserve the sacred constitutional rights of free public schools and separation of church and state. Although Black later distanced himself from the Klan, his distaste for Catholicism did not diminish. Black's admixture of progressive, Klan, and strict separationist views is best understood in terms of anti-Catholicism, and more broadly, a deep hostility to assertions of ecclesiastical authority. And of course, Black brings this very ideology to the Supreme Court in the decisions of the mid-20th century. Now, the terms separation of church and state and wall of separation, although not necessarily expressions of intolerance, I'm suggesting to you here that in the American experience, they have often been closely identified with the ugly impulses of nativism and bigotry. These phrases in our cultural and political experience have been so freighted with nativist and bigotist connotations that I believe we must reconsider the propriety of their continued use in legal and political discourse. If, as I have argued, the wall is a profoundly flawed metaphor for First Amendment doctrine, then should we search for better alternative metaphors, such as one used by James Madison? James Madison once used an interesting metaphor of a line of separation. Might lead to some interesting discussions and thought, but I don't think it's a worthy pursuit to look for an alternative metaphor. Rather, I would argue we are best served by simply returning to the text of the First Amendment. Jefferson's figurative language has not produced the practical solutions to real-world controversy that its apparent clarity and directness led its proponents to expect. Indeed, the wall has done what walls often do. It has obstructed the view. It has obfuscated our understanding of constitutional principles governing church-state relationships. The repetitious, uncritical use of felicitous phrases, Justice Frankfurter once observed, bedevils the law, and I quote from him. He says, "A phrase begins life as a literary expression. Its felicity leads to its lazy repetition, and repetition soon establishes it as a legal formula undiscriminatingly used to express different and sometimes contradictory ideas," end quote. Figures of speech designed to simplify and liberate thought end often by trivializing or enslaving it. Therefore, as Judge Benjamin Cardozo once counseled, metaphors in law are to be narrowly watched. I think this is advice that courts would do well to heed. Thank you. I think we got some time to take a few questions. Yes, ma'am.
Was responsible for taking prayer out of the school. Her son, William Murray, is working now to negate her mischief. With a present atheist who is now suing the Supreme Court to throw the chaplains out of convents. How can we stop these atheists who are up to no good? We are reaping results of this through the crime we have in schools, the lack of core values in schools.
Okay. Well, I think there are a lot of things that we can do. They're going to require work. And I think we're part of that enterprise here this morning. I think, it starts with a reading and understanding of our history. I think so many of us have been so content to sit back and let others tell us what the history is, even when that history is distorted, twisted, inaccurate. And this is the kind of history that's taught in our public schools and in our colleges and universities. So it shouldn't surprise us that this version of history is sort of pervading the culture. It becomes part of the judicial culture and part of our law. So it starts, I think, with an awesome responsibility that we all have to bear, which is to study and study for ourselves. And then we have to share what it is that we learn. And that's part of what this organization is about. And I think it's a very important, it's a vital part of it. I think we sort of continue that through the political process. We contribute to that end by insisting that our political leaders select and confirm judges who have a proper understanding of the Constitution and constitutional history. So, all of these, I think, come together. But, at the center of all of these is the responsibility that we each bear and that we're going to have to sort of exercise. Yes, sir.
Without legislative relief, is this issue not really a dead one? In the near term or even the midterm, and in a multicultural world which we're becoming, maybe isn't it better just to leave it alone?
Okay. Do you have a mountaintop that we can all go to? Well, I think that there are some encouraging signs on the very topic that we're talking about today. And of course, the topic that I've raised today is intertwined with a whole cluster of related topics. But on what we're talking about this morning, I personally see some encouraging signs. If I gave a talk like I gave this morning 20 years ago, I would probably be hooted out of the room. Maybe not with this same audience, but in academia, in sort of public settings. But I think there's been a very interesting sort of shift taking place, even as we speak. 20 years ago, there was perhaps one justice on the Supreme Court that was in any sense responsive to the kinds of arguments I made this morning. There had been one justice who was even sort of knowledgeable about the history that we've been talking about this morning. Today, I would say all the justices are aware of the arguments, are aware of the history, and there are 3, 4, possibly 5 justices on the Supreme Court, possibly. I guess we'll get a closer sense of that in a few months, who are at least sympathetic to that. Okay, I would say at least 3 justices are sympathetic. Now, I think that's progress. It's kind of like, I suspect we have a few Navy people in the room, but it's a little bit like trying to turn an Air Force carrier around. It's not something that can be done swiftly and easily. Now, I'm a firm believer that ideas have consequences. And so, I don't think that I'm going to sort of change the debate and change the world myself, but I think I can help contribute to change in the debate. There are others who are doing the same thing, others who did it long before me, others who will do it after me. And I think that there's been some real shifts in academic thinking on these topics. The point that I made earlier today about federalism, I think is indisputable. The underlying principle of federalism to the First Amendment, to Jefferson's Wall. 20 years ago, you'd have a hard time finding 2 or 3 academics who even understood that component of our history as it relates to this debate. But today there are books coming out that are exploring this theme, and I think that there's some real reason for optimism. Nothing is going to change quickly, I don't think, but I think that we're seeing some shifts, some developments that I think are hopeful. I'll take 2 more questions. Let me also mention I did bring an article, a very short article that I've written that summarizes some of the things I've talked about this morning, talks about some other things that I did not talk about. For example, how did this metaphor enter into the court's language? How did the court come to be aware of this metaphor? So I'm going to make that available. If someone wants to pick that up, please be my guest. So I see a hand right here.
Sir, as we fight the global war on terror, and of course the association of the Muslim religion, what would you give us for a few lessons that we should be careful not to have to relearn?
Okay. I think this is an opportunity, a good question. It's an opportunity for me to say something that if I had more time I would have liked to have elaborated on, and that is what I am not arguing for here this morning. Okay? I am not arguing here today for an established church, even if it were my church, which is a pretty good church. I invite you to come out next Sunday. I go to McLean Presbyterian Church, so please come join us. But I'm not arguing for an established church. I'm not arguing for a union of church and state. Okay? What I'm arguing for is for a public life that has a place for the religious voice, that allows religious people, and that includes members of my church, your church, and includes Muslims, okay, to participate in public affairs, to contribute to the public debate. Now, we all understand, without any discussion, that the right of religious liberty is not an absolute right. There are things done in the name of religion which I think the founding generation would have said is not to be tolerated. Our own courts today would not accept and tolerate. I think Jefferson probably said it fairly well in his famous bill for establishing religious freedom here in Virginia, signed into law in 1786, where he said something to the effect, he says, it's time enough when these religious sentiments break out into public disorder, threats to our public safety. Okay? And so we all understand that there are things done in the name of the religion that are a threat to fundamental public safety, public health, public order. Okay? And I think that's a pretty appropriate place to draw the line. And I think we have to be an open society that invites people of faith, whatever their persuasion, to participate in that public life, but recognize that there are lines beyond which I think society has an appropriate place in sort of stepping in and saying we won't tolerate that. Okay? Right behind you, yes. Mm-hmm.
Back in the Revolutionary era, it would probably been pretty strange for government to silence or muzzle a particular pastor or minister. But today, all the priests, pastors, and ministers are controlled in what they can and cannot say about politics from the pulpit. Can you explain how that, briefly explain how that happened, how that we went from being a society where ministers were free to say what they wanted about politics, and then where we've come full circle where ministers are scared to mention anything about politics?
Okay. Well, I think this raises some more recent history that I'm not that familiar with, but I think you're probably referring more to the IRS regulations, which come from the directives of Congress. I think this came out in the mid 1950s. Lyndon Johnson, when he was the Senate Majority Leader, was somewhat unhappy about how some ministers had dealt with him during his own senatorial campaign. And so it's, you know, this is a part, I think, of a larger set of events. Remember, the court language that I was quoting from earlier comes from 1947, comes out of a milieu where there is this growing sort of desire and willingness to sort of relegate religious matters strictly to the private sphere. Okay? But actually the kind of IRS policies, I think, go even beyond that and silencing the church. I think this is just horrifying, actually. And I think it would have been very disconcerting to the founding generation. The founding generation, and I think this is such an important point, I think there was almost no dissent on the point that I'm about ready to make here, and that is this. The founding generation did not support freedom of religion or free exercise of religion out of a sense of benevolence. That it's a good thing, it's a nice thing to allow the religious voice to be heard in the public square. They believe that, I'm sure that it's a good thing, but that wasn't their motivation. The reason why they were promoting the free exercise of religion is because they understood, like Washington says in his farewell address, you have to have a moral foundation to support social order and political prosperity, and you need to have the freedom to free the moral voice, moral spokesman, to free pastors and clergymen. You've got to liberate them so they can publicly speak out in building that foundation. So they can publicly speak out against sin in high places without fear or retribution. And so when the framers created this government and they enshrine in that system freedom of religion, they were ensuring, they were motivated by a desire to protect the social order itself. So again, this isn't simply about being nice and benevolent to the faith community. They were doing it out of a sense of self-preservation for the political system, the political order that they had created. And so when you come along, like IRS regulations, and say, hey, you clergymen, when you're in your pulpit behind that holy desk, you can't speak out against the great public concerns and moral issues of our day, I think they're doing exactly the opposite of what the founding generation had in mind. And I think they would have found that very worrisome.
Well, I stood up here greatly enjoying, as I'm sure everybody else did, the remarks, and looking back on it, I believe that this is the first time in the years that we have held these Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfasts that we have had as our speaker a full-time college professor address us. But I think we picked a great one. And we really appreciate your coming, and we benefited. I'm sure there wasn't a person here who didn't learn from your presentation, and we are so glad that there are professors like you, because we know there are an awful lot who are by no means like you. Let me give you as a little token of our appreciation a Leadership Institute Adam Smith tie.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I invite you all to join us on Wednesday, March 3rd. And by the way, Professor, if you are interested, it's the first Wednesday of every month. If you proved you could get here early in even pretty bad weather, so you're welcome anytime here. Our speaker on Wednesday, March 3rd, will be conservative author and extraordinary woman, Midge Dector, will be our speaker on next month. And those guests who would like a tour of the building could meet at the podium immediately upon adjournment here. Seth Kraus will give you the tour. Seth, where are you? There you are. Work your way down here now, Seth. He will be happy to give you a tour of the building. And again, thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again soon and often. Thanks again.